Alright, so this is one that I never really anticipated that I would ever do, but it actually occurred to me recently that I hadn't watched Anchorman 2 since it came out almost 5 years ago, when we also did a review for it back then also. And the only thing I really remembered was that I remembered a few scenes here and there, and the fact that overall I think I ended up praising it quite a bit. And I think it, obviously over time, not so much, but when it first came out, I feel like I remember it having a pretty decent reception. And then just for some reason, I just kind of never went back to it. And then I decided to just kind of out of the blue, like last week, and then it occurred to me that I was struggling to figure out what it was I had initially praised about it. And since I'd rather gouge out my own eyes and ears instead of watch my own videos, I decided, why don't I just talk about it again and just do something that, as far as I know, is might be totally different. There are some scenes that I hated back then that I'm still hate now, but for the most part, the only thing I remember is that I felt quite positive towards it. Maybe it could have been because I like wanted it to be so good, despite the fact that it was in the well, this was pre Dumb and Dumber 2, so there was still like hope for long delayed sequels, at least a little bit. Also pre Zoolander 2, so but maybe this was actually the start of that sort of downward slope. I'm trying to remember if there were any more in this area prior to this that were as like soul-crushingly bad as like Dumb and Dumber 2 or Zoolander 2. And while this certainly doesn't reach those levels, I do just feel a need to... I don't recommend going back and looking at the videos from 2013 because I was still starting out doing this, so it's probably like an absolute, cringe fest, so I wouldn't. We'll just do this now. So, but in order to do that, I figure why not start with the first one, so we have a basis, because pretty much anything I say that's bad about Anchorman 2 can go back to this is why it did work in the first one, so I thought, why not just do these together? Because like, it could have been just another Adam McKay comedy just against each other, which probably will eventually happen, but in the meantime I figure why not do this, especially since Adam McKay's probably about to have another movie in the Oscar race. It makes sense. So, yeah, so let's actually go back, what is it, like 14 years to when the first one came out. And this was one of those ones where our friend group, mostly Owen, who runs the channel, was building this up for a long time before it came out. And I remember the night that we all saw it was like waiting for New Year's or something, because it was going to be one of those midnight shows. And it was like, they were just building it up and building it up. And then, of course, once it came out, everybody was quoting it. Up to this day, they still are, 14 years later. So that says something. It says something about its reputation and the fact that it can hold up to that. But that's the problem, though, is it's like going into this... Because I sort of had this problem with Dumb and Dumber, for instance, among other things. It's like, how do you go into, like, reviewing a movie that's a comedy that's basically just known for its quotes? It's like, what can you really say except for... Because if you were to ask anybody why they love Anchorman, they'd probably just throw, like, 50 quotes at you and say nothing else. But that would be, like, enough. Like, that would make the point. But, so, we're gonna give this a go, I guess. It is worth noting that we do have an interesting setup here, and by that I mean basically the lead into it being made. Because I think, the movie I don't think ever says this, but I think somebody like did the math and added up like the events in the movie and came to, it might be 1977 that it's set in, just going by the events, how they line up, I guess. But the thing about this is that it's actually sort of based on real, like, not based on, but inspired by real people. Like, there was a news anchor, Mort Krim, that I guess Will Ferrell was watching and was like, I could totally create a character around this. And then Veronica kind of came from a woman named Jessica Savage. And basically there was like a documentary where they talked about the sexism in their industry, particularly him towards her. But the weird thing about the fact that this spawned a movie like Anchorman is if you, like, look up Jessica Savage's Wikipedia, it is like one of the most tragic life stories like ever. And I think she died at like 36 or something, and pretty much all the way up to that point, it was bad. So interestingly enough, this movie sort of spawned from that. And another thing to look at is the fact that apparently a huge champion for this movie from the beginning was Paul Thomas Anderson. Like, Paul Thomas Anderson was actually for a long time going to be like a credited producer, or at least in that area. And at the point in time that he kind of, I guess there were quite a few ideas leading up to what exactly this was going to be, because it took Will Ferrell and Adam McKay a long time to convince a studio that they could make a feature-length comedy about news anchors without it being like just basically, because the setup sounds like basically nothing more than a sketch, like SNL's Weekend Update thing or something, that it's like at feature length. So it was like a hard sell. So they had a bunch of different scenarios. And I guess when Paul Thomas Anderson decided, you know what, guys, you go ahead, I'll step out of this, was the fact that I guess at one point in time, one of the scripts was a spoof of the movie Alive with Ethan Hawke, where it's the plane crashes and they have to eat the dead bodies to survive. Only it was news anchors, and I guess like there were like orangutans or something in the crash that were trained to be ninjas, and it was like sort of like when you see the rumble in it. The originally like a huge portion of the movie was going to be news anchors versus ninja monkeys. Uh, and that was going to be the movie, apparently. And that's when Paul Thomas Anderson, I believe, was like, you know what, I'm going to step back. And I'll just let you guys have it. And of course, obviously we did end up with Judd Apatow's name on it, of course. Who also has a cameo in it. He's the guy when Brian walks through wearing Sex Panther, he's the guy that stands up and says, it smells like a turd covered in burnt hair. So for some reason it took me the longest time to realize that, even though I have such a good idea of what Judd Apatow looks like. For some reason it took me forever to realize that was him. I guess I just never paid attention to who was talking, just what they were saying. It smells like Bigfoot's dick was my personal favorite in that scene. That woman's delivery was perfect. But there's also, and obviously, you know, hand in hand with Judd Apatow, there's also Seth Rogen has the, he plays the cameraman that's filming the cat fashion show. That's another thing to where it's like, we all know what Seth Rogen looks like, but for some reason it took me forever to realize that was him, because he's there so briefly. And this was before he was like a really big deal. This was like 3 years before Knocked Up, and he took off, and I think the year before the 40-Year-Old Virgin. So, yeah, now going in that direction, speaking of the 40-Year-Old Virgin, the one thing that really backs this movie up is the supporting cast, of course. Starting with Paul Rudd, and this is one of those cases where it's like you can obviously there's the whole 70s thing, and it's like if anybody else really went all in on the 70s aspect as much as Will Ferrell did in this scenario, it would be Paul Rudd. With just the whether it be his appearance or just that just he sort of goes like right hand in hand with Ron Burgundy in the way because where Ron Burgundy has that arrogance that gets him by, Brian Fantana has like it's not quite arrogance, but it's this huge overconfidence in everything that he does. even when he's getting lines thrown at him like it smells like Bigfoot's dick, or for the cologne he's wearing, he still kind of has like a confident swagger about him, and he's like willing to not accept that there might be flaws here. And of course he's the perfect casting choice for that. And then of course there is Steve Carell, who I don't know what exactly. I mean, you could say how would people, you know, in this culture now react to a character like that. Well, I guess we kind of got that because Anchorman 2 was only 5 years ago, but even then, still. But that's honestly not, I hardly even think about that. I guess because I'm just so, the character's just so ingrained in our memories now, exactly the way that he is. But what Steve Carell does here is that he could have done, long story short, he could have done what he does in Anchorman 2. But to describe that a little bit, the thing that he does right here is he does do the thing where it's clear sometimes he's saying things that are clearly something a comedic character would say, just because, just the randomness factor, I guess, they really, really cash in on. But there's something about Steve Carell's deliveries here where, yet sometimes it seems a much more, like, sort of, I don't know if self-aware is the right word, but aware that it's in a comedy when he says something while he's smiling. And it's like, even though he's still so oblivious that what he's saying just makes absolutely no sense, is part of the comedy, it's a lot funnier in those scenes when he says the things that he says with, like, a very dramatic sincerity. Like, the particular moment when he when he says, "I love Lamp," and they're trying to, like, call him out, and he's saying, you're just, saying things in the room when we're saying things that we actually love. But that second time he says, "I love Lamp," it looks like he's gonna cry. And, it's like, you actually kind of believe for a second that he actually believes that, and it's not just one of those random lines. That's what makes it so funny then. And when he's able to do stuff like that is when it really does work. So, and it goes just beyond the whole, oh, he does funny things because he has brain damage, or whatever, however they explained it. And then there's David Koechner as Champ Kind, which is, he's obviously, because you've got, Rudd and Steve Carell playing these really attention-grabbing side characters, Koechner is the one that just kind of gets the low end of all that. He gets, you could tell that I think they realize this because of how much they blatantly overcompensate for it in Anchorman 2. It's like they went as far as to give his character a catchphrase that he uses, like, twice. And so that's kind of this indication of just how underutilized this character is. But I mean, even if you were to utilize him, I don't really know how much you could get from this. I do know that he's certainly the least memorable, but it's also, if you read into it, it's my understanding that John C. Reilly was going to play him, and he had to turn it down because he was doing The Aviator, which is really weird because, like, that's this huge, gigantic Scorsese movie, and if I remember correctly, he plays a decent part in that movie. He's one of those guys that's, like, always with DiCaprio. But John C. Reilly has actually said that he regrets turning down Anchorman. Maybe not necessarily he regrets doing The Aviator in its place, just that he regrets that he couldn't be an Anchorman. Maybe that's what it is, but surely. But, so I wonder what he possibly could have brought to it, because we definitely got to see in later movies by Adam McKay what exactly they could do together. Obviously, I'm not a big fan of Step Brothers at all, and I know that's a really controversial opinion, but I do love Talladega Nights, and I love their back and forth in it, so I wonder what the character of Champ could have been like with him, whether it would have been, if he could have elevated it a little more, or if it was just always doomed in the writing process. It's kind of hard to tell, so, and even then, it's like, when he does get a moment, like, when he's trying to cheer Ron up, and he says, "Hey, do you want to go to the zoo, flip off the monkeys?" And it's like, that's one of his funniest lines, but then you realize, it just, even in the delivery, it just feels like this low-rent version of Norm Macdonald's line in Billy Madison when he says, "Do you want to feed that donkey some beer, get it all messed up?" And then it just kind of takes sort of the impact out of that line, and it just reminds you of another joke that was better delivered. And then there's this whole thing that also carries on through both movies, where another running punchline with Champ's character is that he has, like, this "he loves Ron too much" sort of gag, and that was never really, like, in either of the movies, even a much more successful one like the first movie, they just cannot get that joke to work, but good God, do they keep trying. They're hoping, like, one of these times that Champ loves Ron too much joke is going to work, and it never does. It's like, I don't know why that was the one they were like, if first we don't succeed, let's just keep fucking doing it. So, yeah, so overall, I don't know how much the Champ character really works, but when it's like all of them in a group together, they do kind of bounce off in a way that makes them all sort of stand out in the moment. Like the Afternoon Delight scene, for instance, where it's like, in any other movie, especially a comedy, a scene where, like, the movie stops and everybody just sings would be like a death curse. And you would wonder just constantly, like, why is this in here? This is just filler, it's not funny, it's not doing anything. But no, the Afternoon Delight scene is very funny, because I don't know if it's just, it could be the suddenness of it, and it could be the fact that it's not like a whole number, they go completely a cappella. And then it's like, it's short, it's brief, and then it abruptly ends and they all walk away. And I think the fact that they hit, like, just those comedic notes just right with it, makes it a funny scene that in another movie probably would have been way too dragged out, and just been this horrible thing in the middle of the movie that just did not work at all. But they went for it, and it actually does pay off, so that's great. And they only do it that one time. that's a big deal. That's definitely, if I can't remember if they mention it or not in the second movie. Maybe they do once, but I feel like if they had tried that bit in the second movie, it would have come back like 5 times, and it would have been dragged out longer and longer each time, and just killed it even more. And it's like the key to it is that they did it once briefly. So yes, take notes from yourself before you make Anchorman 2, I guess. Um, and then there's also some great stuff, like, there's a lot of standalone scenes, where, like, this is one of those movies where sometimes a joke can be its own scene, which, once again, sometimes can be a bit of a curse, because it's like, eventually the joke is going to die. But then you have moments like the flute thing, another musical moment that seems like it could have died very quickly, but it's that use of misdirection, to where it's like, he goes up there, and it's funny in itself that he has the flute prepared, and then when he starts off, you think he's going to be terrible at it, and it would be so true in Ron Burgundy's fashion for him to do something so confidently that he might be terrible at. So when he starts to play it, like, badly, we get a sense that that's where the scene's going, and we already believe it. But then the twist to the scene is that he's annoyingly good. It's like, he's so good that it's over the top. And that's where the big turn in that is. So that's where, when you really break it down, that's what makes the flute scene so funny. And the fact that it's actually funnier the more it goes, because the more it goes, the more over the top he gets, and showing off the better that he is. So they just knew exactly what they were doing with these bits that could so easily die in another movie. And there is sometimes where, like, a joke is funny, but they get a little too ahead of themselves, and it's like, where they could have used the misdirection, and it probably still could have worked in that same vein if they didn't blow it in just a really weird way. And that's, the use of the narrator is good. But the problem with this is that the scene when he hits Jack Black with the burrito. Because that setup in itself is hilarious. But the trouble is that just before it happens, the narrator says something along the lines of, a mere act of littering changed everybody's lives forever. So at that point we already know what's going to happen, and we know that that's going to be how this scene ends. Obviously it does take it up a notch with the Baxter getting punted off the bridge thing, but still, this joke in itself would have been absolutely hilarious with no build up to it or no clue to it whatsoever. And it's when he's obviously driving down the road and he's eating a burrito, which by itself kind of has you asking questions, but then we see Jack Black right up beside him, and we already see that it's Jack Black, so we know he's going to work his way into this scene somehow. And we can kind of piece it together because the narrator said the littering thing. But it still is kind of funny, because it may still not quite be what we're thinking, because this burrito is almost an entire burrito. It looks like he's taken 2 bites out of it, and it's this full-length burrito. And his response is, I love this burrito, but it sure is filling. Despite the fact that it looks like he's taken 2 bites. And his response to this is to chuck the entire thing out the window. And it's like, and obviously hits Jack Black with it, which, once again, is really funny in itself, but you can sort of see the setup coming because of the littering thing, and it's like, if you just did not think his initial reaction was going to be, after 2 bites of this burrito, it's so filling, I'm going to get rid of it like this, it probably would have hit a lot more. But like I said, that doesn't mean it's not still funny, because it absolutely is, but, yeah, just sometimes they get a little too ahead of themselves, like in that moment. And then, of course, there is the use of cameos, which, once again, like, Zoolander 2 was so fucking bad about this. Remember when cameos were, like, a really big deal, and they would just, you would be so thrown off sometimes that you would just see this person appear so unexpectedly. This was back in a time, Anchorman was back in a time where movies could still get away with that, because cameos in movies now, you hear about, like, months and months in advance, and the surprise factor is gone. So, when you're watching Anchorman, if you know that he and Jack Black have a friendship in real life, then maybe it's not, like, you see it, it surprises you, but you can put the pieces together. But even so, it's when, we've got Vince Vaughn doing Wes Mantooth, of course, who pops up a couple of times. But then we have Luke Wilson appear, which is funny. Then we have Ben Stiller appear, which is funny, because it's like, these are big names in the other movies, like Old School and the like, coming in, and, you know, like Dodgeball, and anything else in this group. And it makes sense, because we've seen all these actors in these other movies before. And then comes in Tim Robbins, fresh off his Oscar win for Mystic River, as the other guy. And once again, if you know his connection to Jack Black, it makes a little sense, and then a couple years later he was in Tenacious D and stuff like that. But at this time, like I said, especially fresh off Mystic River, it was like mind-blowing that Tim Robbins waltzed into this brawl, and just fully into this character too. I love the running joke throughout the brawl that he never stops smoking his pipe no matter what's going on. Like when he starts off that way, and then when he cuts off Luke Wilson's arm, and Luke Wilson is standing there saying, like, I did not see that coming, Tim Robbins is just standing in the background proudly smoking his pipe, with the battle still raging on behind him. And then he continues to, as he's running away when the cops show up. And it's like, that, I really miss when cameos could do that. And then there's also the thing in, like, Anchorman 2, where it's like, we'll get to this, obviously, but, it just feels like the whole cameo thing is so abused now. And it's like, they really, really go all out, and after a while, it's like, it's so abused, and people go so all out with that kind of stuff that, it's almost like the surprise factor is gone, no matter how big you go, but, like, we'll get to that when we go to the second one also, but, yeah, and then there is, and yeah, also going on the brawl as well, there's a reason it's like one of the more famous scenes in a comedy for quite some time. Because there's also, obviously, the "that escalated quickly" line, but there's one bit that I really love that just kind of goes right on by, and it's the fact that before the brawl starts, Wes Mantooth is just like making fun of them and calling them names and stuff like that. And then the brawl happens, there's a guy on fire, there's dudes on horses, there's the giant net, there's the dude that Brick kills, Brick has a grenade for some reason, and all this carnage. And after all of this is broken out, and they discuss the fact that Brick killed a guy, Brian Fantana's response is, "Do you believe Wes Mantooth saying that stuff about us?" And it's like, he's so upset about being called names by Wes Mantooth, it's like he completely disregards that the brawl happened. That's just a little moment that I've always loved, too, that's just kind of subtly in there. So yeah, that's just, so there's the whole construction, but then there's also just, the big portion, the whole core of the movie, the back and forth between him and Christina Applegate, and the business angle with Fred Willard playing the boss, all this really works also, and the way they sort of play up what the time was like and the sexism between them. And it is easy to see where Wolf, despite, you know, some of the tragic stories that may have led up to this, it's easy to see where Will Ferrell saw, like, a comedy in this kind of thing. Like I said, even if it was a hard sell, the fact that they got it here and they were able to pull this off, it just, all in all, when you see it, it just does make perfect sense. And the way that, if I were to think about somebody, because usually, obviously, in comedies, the female lead is usually like, you know, a wife or a love interest or whatever, and she's just kind of in there. It's the way Christina Applegate has to be like the whole other side of this to what Will Ferrell's doing is something like, she's not somebody I probably would have immediately gravitated towards in thinking about this. So that was kind of unexpected in a big way also, that she could really be like his equal in this whole thing, and the way they bounce off of each other really does work also, and the way that she does have like that attitude where it's believable, the way whenever she like just comes right in and just stands her ground to somebody this obliviously arrogant, which makes for great comedy. It builds him up even more, and then the way she bounces off of it, they just stay like right here, which really helps. So yeah, and then yeah, and like I said at the beginning, it's like, it is, you know, it's one of those movies where, like, I think the quotes are memorable and they're so funny and they work so well, is the fact that, yes, I am basically describing memes at this point, but it is, like, the fact that you can take so many of these lines out of context, and they're funny in any context that you put them with. Because so many of them work in that way, like "that escalated quickly," or "I'm not even mad, that's amazing." There's even, like, I can imagine somebody, like, with this, like, somebody brushing off a visible erection with the line, "it's the pleats." So yeah, it really just works on all those fronts. Like I said, sometimes it may not fall flat, and it may be, if you're comparing it to the second one, makes it look even better and more accomplished, but yeah, and the jokes are just constant too, like all the way through the end credits, where we even have the gag reel bit, when it's one of those movies that has the gag reel during the credits where they forget their lines, or they're doing the different improvised lines, or they can't help but laugh or whatever. And then once again, it's not something that repeats. They just do it once, and it's never acknowledged, and it just goes right on by. Where they inserted one outtake from Smokey and the Bandit. I want to say Smokey and the Bandit 2, actually. And then they just go right back into their own gag reel, and nothing comes of that. Just like, even the fact that they took the jokes that far into the movie, like they're so nonstop, even doing a gag reel in the credits has its own joke. And that's just fantastic. That's beautiful. So I think that's why Anchorman has stood the test of time so much, and why 14 years later it's still like one of the most quoted comedies of all time, and people still reference it. People are still watching it. Even if they're not watching it, watching it again may not even be necessary, because everybody seems to know it by heart at this point. So it's like, there may be people that haven't seen it in like years and years and years that don't even realize that, because they just know it so well. So yeah, that's where Anchorman stands. Now, to get into the whole thing that set this off, which would be the sequel, once again, I remember praising this. I think mainly what I did was I just embraced it, and I was able to just kind of laugh. Even if they didn't work, it was just like, I guess you could say the movie is like likable enough and energetic enough that it kind of pulls you in, and when you're first seeing it, you can just laugh along with the jokes and not really think too much about it, and then just go on, and then revisit it 5 years later and realize what the fuck happened. So, once again, if you really are doing a comparison, you look at the opening scene of Anchorman, which, once again, very funny scene, when Ron's doing his vocal exercises, and he's just saying stuff like, the Human Torch was denied a bank loan, stuff like that. What was the one? The arsonist has oddly shaped feet, something like that. And that's all he's doing, just saying these odd phrases. And it's really funny. But they also have a purpose, because he's doing the vocal exercises before he starts. You immediately catch on to what's wrong when you compare that to what happens in Anchorman 2. Because I have bashed Will Ferrell a number of times, pretty much between Step Brothers to now. And it's because he just really... Will Ferrell has this way to where he just seems to really go... Everything has to be like... He's such a pain in the ass to watch on talk shows, too, because it's like he always has to be doing a damn bit, no matter what it is. And it's so dragged out, and he's really trying with the deadpan thing. Like, I get it, and I get that that's like his skill. But still, there's just something here to where everything just kind of has to be so over the top. If it's not completely and totally deadpan, it's way too over the top. It's like he's really struggling to find a middle ground. In movies like Get Hard, when he's supposed to be playing the straight role, he just comes off bland. Unfortunately, revisiting Ron Burgundy brought out a little too over the top side. And like I said, when you look at the first Anchorman, there's stuff that goes way over the top, but that's what works about it. But this one just seems to lose what made that. Because like I said, you look at what he's doing with the vocal exercises in Anchorman. What are the vocal exercises in Anchorman 2? Just him shrieking and being really loud and just babbling nonsense. You could say he was babbling nonsense in the other one, but there was something controlled about it. You could tell what he was saying, and that's what made it funny. One of the things that made it funny. And here, it's just like he's doing everything that he's done in his bad movies now. To where it's like he completely misses everything that he clearly knows about, how skilled it takes somebody to be to do some of the comedy that he's done. Kind of like in the first Anchorman. And just like, you just immediately see that first nail in the coffin when he's doing the vocal exercises and he's just screaming nothing. So, and then it completely goes on like a completely different path with the character, just to go about its really mundane story, because one of the things that made Anchorman work also in regards to his character was, even though he was so inept, and even though he was so arrogant, he was, like, amazing at his job. Like, stay classy was the whole thing. And it's like, you just totally bought that, and obviously, it's like, he doesn't know what's going on, but he knows to read the prompter, even if he's a little flawed because he reads everything, but still, he does that perfectly. So the way they set off Anchorman 2 is he's fired by Harrison Ford, because suddenly he's terrible at his job. The big joke in the middle of Anchorman is that he's known for being classy, and the big turnaround is when he says on the air, "Go fuck yourself, San Diego." And at the very beginning of Anchorman, we see that he casually says shit on the air now. And it's like, where does that come from? That's totally not what the character was. The whole conflict, the big conflict in the middle of the movie came from the fact that he's not that dude. Because he shocked the world when he said, "Go fuck yourself" on the air. Because he hadn't said anything like that at all. And they just make him this inept fucking moron while he's supposed to be on. And that's really not who they built this character up to be. It's just so he could get fired, so the conflict can happen where Veronica takes his spot. And he has to go somewhere else and go into depression and shit. And it just feels so like there could have been a billion ways for you to set off the conflict of this movie without just changing the character. Because it's like, if you're gonna... Because it's like, what are the... What like, the ways... The reasons we all loved Anchorman. And it's like, why we fear what things might go wrong in the second movie when we're building up to it. Because it's like, how much, is going to change or whatever. But it's like, if there's one thing you don't want to do, you can change the events around the character. That's kind of the point. But to change the character entirely sort of defeats the purpose of revisiting him at all, doesn't it? So that's... I mean, at least in this extreme sort of way. Like I said, you can change his circumstances, sure, but you change his circumstances here by completely changing him entirely, and it doesn't make sense, and it's a weird fucking start that just goes downhill from there. So, and then it turns into... He goes and he gets the crew and all that, which is a funny series of events, sort of. Where it's like, somehow everybody knows what everybody else doesn't. Where he doesn't know where Brian is, so Champ says, "Oh, you didn't hear?" And then somehow both he and Champ don't know where Brick is, and so it has to be Brian that says, "Oh, you didn't hear?" And then it's this chain of events that eventually gets them here. And then once they take off, there's a whole lot of... those really bad comedies where it just feels like most of it is improv, and as you're watching it, sometimes it can be infectious, but a lot of the time it's like you're just watching comedians hang out, and the jokes feel more like you had to be there comedy. Like, whenever all the characters are saying something and they're all laughing and they're all talking at once and all that, and your audience is just sitting here stone-faced, you expect one of the actors to just kind of turn to the camera and say, "Oh, had you been on the set, this would have been hilarious." Like, you don't have the whole context. It feels like an entire movie almost of that, which is kind of a really bad sign to start off with. Not to say that it doesn't have some great moments here and there. Like, sometimes the way they play with the timeline, it's a lot more forced in this one, of course, talking about being set in the 80s now. Like, obviously after he gets fired, he goes and he works at SeaWorld, and somebody on the intercom comes on and says, like, BP Oil is sponsoring this event, and they call it BP Oil, nature's best friend. Stuff like that, because it's like way in the background, too. Like, it's just over an intercom, over a scene that's not even related to the joke itself. It's just a joke that's in there, and that's great. And then probably my favorite joke in the movie is the one where Brian says he's going to go hang out with Robert Blake, O.J. Simpson, and Phil Spector, and it's like, "We call ourselves the Lady Killers." And it's like, that's a joke that really works, and it's a nice way to sort of play with the 80s setting. But most of it feels really forced, if even there at all. So, and when it is there, it's just like, you can acknowledge, like, yeah, I can see where that could have been clever, but it just doesn't. The execution's just so flat, it just doesn't matter anymore. So, and yeah, the line about his son... when he obviously is having trouble in school, and Ron just kind of says, "Are you sure he's not a midget with a learning disability?" It's definitely not without funny lines, absolutely. But the problem here is that we also have a moment where, once again, every now and then this happened in the first movie also, but not enough to where it really stood out as a problem. And it didn't take away from the jokes, that's the most important thing. But this whole thing that's in the worst of comedies, that I'm sure you've seen in plenty of bad movies, is this whole thing where the jokes happen, and the audience understands the joke, gets the joke, knows where it's coming from, sees the punchline, gets it, it should be end of scene. But this movie is obsessed with having the characters comment on the jokes, like, either while they're happening, after we already get them, or even after they've already happened. For some reason, they just kind of have to punctuate it with somebody reminding the audience, like, that's what the joke was. Like, it's like they got so worried people weren't laughing. Like I said, it's almost like they're breaking the fourth wall and trying to check to make sure the audience, at least if they're not laughing, knows that, don't worry, in another context this would be funny, don't worry. It's like they're saying, you know, it's like, did you catch that this was the punchline? Did you catch that's what we were going for? And that just really, that's just a problem. Like the Australian joke, for instance. When we meet the Australian guy, and there's actually a couple reasons this joke doesn't work. Because he shows up, and the joke is that he's Australian. So he speaks in a really heavy accent, which of course is just gibberish in an accent. And he's just going and going, and there's no English in there. It's just babbling, just with the accent. So we know that because he's Australian, he's hard to understand. And we have shots of Ron Burgundy watching him, saying the words, "We can't understand you," long after this joke's been going on. There are so many, like 90% of the jokes in the movie do this. And it's frustrating. But then there's also the fact that that joke doesn't work anyway, because after they get this one joke where he just babbles nonsense in an accent, we understand every word he says for the rest of the movie. They couldn't commit to that joke. They had to make it once, Australians talk funny. And then and then for the rest of the movie we can understand him after we got that joke out of the way. So, what was even the damn point? That's, I mean, maybe you can equate it to like a Looney Tunes thing, where like it only matters for the sake of the bit. Like when the coyote gets struck by lightning and he's like all shriveled up and black, but then after it fades out in the next scene he's just fine again. And it's like it doesn't matter that they didn't commit to the fact that he's, you know, burnt now. It was just for the sake of the bit, the end, and they can move on. But here it just feels like they had a lazy bit with a lazy execution that didn't even have a place here unless they were going to commit. So yeah, that just failed on all levels. And that's just one in regards to like giving a character one trait. We're not done with that, no. Because there's also stuff like, we'll also talk about the stuff where the jokes are described to us before we go on with the other characters. There is some stuff to where it's like, it's sort of funny. The one time I think it kind of works, I think it works because of Dylan Baker, because Dylan Baker is actually like a really good straight man to the four of them, and he's the one that kind of is stuck with reacting to what they do. And because Dylan Baker's such an incredible actor, he can mostly get by with this without it being too blatant. For instance, the opening scene, which, and a few years later, with Bad Santa 2, it's like, for some reason we want to start these long delayed sequels with the characters unsuccessfully trying to hang themselves and pulling the ceiling down. I guess that was a thing for a while, but obviously Dylan Baker's the one that finds him, and Ron's basically trying to explain what happened, but the thing is he's explaining what happened perfectly, but his tone of voice where he's raising his words make it sound like he's lying, which is the joke. But then Dylan Baker kind of elaborates and says, "It sounds like you're lying, but I think you're telling the truth." And it's like the way he sort of takes that in does kind of make it funny, and the fact that they don't drag that out too long, too. That in itself is a funny joke. But then you have stuff to where, like, it completely derails the scene to add to the joke. Like, if you have a joke or a line, and you can maybe, it in itself is a joke, but if you have, like, one more line that can, like, add on to that joke, that can be really good, too. But this movie will completely derail scenes in order to do that, in ways that don't make sense. Like when Brian says that, he gave Florence Henderson crabs, and then he, like, never called her again or something. what Ron does in this scene is so puzzling, because, and I'm probably overthinking this, but it's annoying, because what happens here is Brian says the "I gave Florence Henderson crabs" line, and then Ron has to chime in and say, "So you spent the night with the mom from the Brady Bunch, and you gave her crabs." And then Brian gets to say his line, the big payoff, which is, "Yeah, gave her a Brady Bunch of crabs." And it's like, what in this line could not have made it better by just having Brian say, "I spent the night with Florence Henderson, gave her a Brady Bunch of crabs"? Why does he have to say one line, then Ron has to entirely recap what he just said so that he can say one more line? You can see why the movie's 2 fucking hours. They treat their jokes like this. So I don't... So yeah, you can just see... And this is the kind of shit... This is just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of shit that drags this movie out to 2 hours. And I'm pretty sure there's an extended version of this fucking thing. Because, of course, it's got Judd Apatow's name on it, so we all know it's going to be overlong and have way too much improv in it. So that's only funny to the people on the set. So, talking about that, we do get to revisit some characters before being introduced to new ones, like Brick. Now, as I said, the reason the Brick is funny in the first movie, but the problem here is that seeing what's done with him in the second one, this has got to probably be the worst performance Steve Carell will ever give. Because obviously Steve Carell is amazing with comedy and amazing with drama. I don't know what the fuck happened. Thankfully this was just before Foxcatcher, so it was like Foxcatcher amended him of like all of his sins. But the problem here is that when the scene in the first movie when everybody's shouting, and then Brick just chimes in and says loud noises, because that's all he knows how to do, because that's all he's taken in from the environment around him. It's like, take that loud noises moment, and it's like they forgot what Brick's character was, and they only remembered stuff like that, and they ran with that when they put his character back together for this one. And like, he'll do that kind of stuff with, like, without provocation, especially in these goddamn Kristen Wiig scenes. The worst scenes in the movie that just go on and on and on forever. And so it's like, we take Brick, and not only do we ruin his character by making him, like, going all in on the whole, oh, he says random stuff, or he's doing random things, like playing a board game alone and eating a head of lettuce like an apple. Fucking hilarious if you're fucking 4. But the problem here is that, while that was funny in the doses we got it in Anchorman, they have, like, tripled Brick's screen time. And not only have they tripled his screen time, there's 2 of him now, because of the Wiig character. Because the Wiig character, the joke is that she's exactly like him. Only problem is that we have to get to know the fact that she's exactly like him. So we have these very long scenes where they just improv bullshit at each other that's not funny at all, with no context whatsoever. And just until the scene finally fucking dies, and he just awkwardly runs away. Just, yeah. And the scenes are, like, long dead. We're having funerals for the scenes when they end. That's how long ago they fucking died by the time we cut to something else. So, with that in mind, we do have, Paul Rudd, like I said, it does seem like he's mostly here to, like, have, Brian in the first movie, just, like, his dialogue just kind of flowed so nicely. And like I said, there was kind of a lot of subtlety in what he was doing, because it's like, sometimes he would say things that you didn't even realize were funny until, like, 3 minutes later. And then here, it's just, like, he's basically... He's like a human bowling pin here. He's, like, constantly being set back up so that somebody else can knock him down with basically explaining every move he's fucking making. They also do the, they rehash the Sex Panther thing with, the condom bit, where he has that thing. But the problem is, and it's like, it's so fucking blatant too, it's like, how did they not realize that this didn't work this way? Because they're trying to rehash, the cologne thing. But the problem is that the cologne had its own setup by him introducing it, and the fact of what its name was. And then the payoff to this was him putting it on and, like, grossing everybody out, walking through, having all those lines thrown at him, having the reactions to it. But the thing is the condom joke is the same joke, but it stops after him saying the names. There's no payoff. It's like they only wanted to rehash the first half of the joke. It's like, if you're gonna, it's like you almost want to encourage it. It's like, so you were gonna rehash your joke, but you only wanted to rehash the first half of it that had nothing to do with the payoff, what ultimately made it funny, more so than anything else. And so you almost want to encourage them, and you're like, well, why the fuck didn't you rehash the whole thing then? I don't understand. It's making me hiccup. That's how bad it is. So, there's that, and once again, they keep dropping the ball with Koechner. He has nothing to do here. They take his jokes from the first movie, they keep trying them again. They still don't work. Like I said, they quadruple down on his catchphrase, whammy, because like I said, I think it's almost like a joke on themselves, because they realized they gave the character a catchphrase and only let him use it twice in the first movie. So now there's literally a scene in the movie where he just says whammy to the camera like 10 fucking times in a row. I know that's also to kind of show how redundant their channel is and how it looks like their channel might be a failure, but the payoff is that it's like the best ratings ever or whatever. But it also kind of felt like that, and it's just like, they've just got nothing to do with this character. They try with the fried bat scene, but once again, that hardly has a payoff either, so yeah. So as far as new characters, I brought up Dylan Baker briefly, but the biggest addition is probably Megan Good, who is the boss now, and they're basically trying to rehash the whole thing with that he did with Veronica in the first movie, where it's like, oh, it's a woman in this time frame now, but they kind of double up on it, so now she's a black woman. So remember how I was talking about basically the new characters are like one joke? Well, that's Megan Good's joke, that she's black. So we have these really embarrassing scenes where, honestly, it's not even just in general they drop the ball so much on this character that any time she walks into the movie stops dead. The movie's got nothing until Burgundy starts making the black comments. So, and there's even time when they're intentionally dragging the scene out once again. So many cases where you can dissect the jokes and realize why this movie is 2 hours for no reason. So we actually have a scene when they're building up like they're gonna fight. And the joke of the scene is that Ron Burgundy is stalling. That he is literally not doing anything. See what I mean by the movie literally stops dead? Like, and it's not even necessarily just because of jokes. It could just stop because that's the point of the scene, is that it stops. But we do also have these black jokes, where we do have the joke where, it's right after, what was it? Oh no, we're jumping ahead. I was still in 2004, sorry. So yes, like, a decade later, or more than a decade later, you remember the joke in Goldmember with Fred Savage, where he had the mole? And the joke was that when Austin Powers was around him, the only thing he could say was the word mole. Well, apparently Will Ferrell and Adam McKay really liked that bit in Goldmember, and then waited, like, 11 years, and they were like, we can do that bit. Only instead of mole, it's black. Just have Ron Burgundy keep saying the word black whenever he's around a person, because that's how awkward he is. So, it does kind of get a laugh out of me when he says it one more time, and he's like, I'm sorry, if I don't say it, I'm going to pass out. But still, just, that's what the joke is. And not only does it feel like a joke from a movie 11 years ago, it just doesn't, it works that one time. It works the one time he says it, and he says it like 15 times. So that tells you where the joke is at, and how funny they thought it was. So, that's really unfortunate. And then, of course, we get, like, to further go into the fact that pretty much everything is going to be a black joke, while this is also rehashing what happened with Veronica in the first movie. You'll remember the first movie, they had that entire animated sequence when he and Veronica had sex the first time. And that was the joke. But it was brief, they didn't drag it out too much, and it was funny because of that, because it was, like, the most unexpected thing to see when that happened, to express that. So, they are going to do the same thing here, but instead of that, they're going to make it another black joke. So, they're going to make it about it being interracial sex. Not only do they begin that by just having Ron Burgundy scream the words interracial sex, that's it. We get 2 clips. It's like them doing it intercut with 2 clips. They couldn't even commit to this. 2 clips of just random interracial things. Like a clip from Different Strokes with who is it, Mr. Drummond and the kids, and then there's like something else, and that's it. That's how they've elaborated on that joke, where in the first movie it was a giant animated sequence. It's like, we're gonna keep doing the interracial joke by showing you 2 clips real quick. It's, how, I don't know how this happened, but we're not done either. And also, once again, it's all about Will Ferrell making noise. That's it. When she's like trying to seduce him rather violently, the joke is that he barks. She wants him to bark and then do a high-pitched bark. Or when she kicks him in the balls, he's just squealing nonsense for a long time. And it's like, these are the jokes that we get. And then lastly, to cap this all off, we get the damn dinner scene with her family. And the thing about it is that, and not only does it go on and on and on and on, here's the problem, is that, I'm going to actually compare it to something else, which makes it even more insulting. You know the really bland-ass, forgettable movie from, what was it, 2005 or something? Guess Who? With Bernie Mac and Ashton Kutcher. It's like, how much more of a forgettable movie can I bring up as an example of what that movie does that this movie can't? If you've seen Guess Who, you might remember the scene when the first night Ashton Kutcher, I remember that I haven't seen that movie since 2005, and I remember this scene so clearly. And it's what this scene is doing. All wrong. What's happening here is that Ashton Kutcher is having dinner, who was it, Zoe Saldana, I think, was Bernie Mac's daughter in the movie. So he's having dinner with them for the first time, and of course it's going to be awkward, but then the joke comes from Kutcher's character gets more and more comfortable in the scene because Bernie Mac is basically inviting him to make race jokes so they can have fun with it. And then the whole point is that Kutcher gets comfortable and more comfortable and more comfortable, and then eventually tells a joke to where it's like, he got way too comfortable. And then the scene escalates because of that. And it's like, for a movie so forgettable, that scene is memorable because of that escalation, makes it funny. What this movie does is there's no sort of comfort level at all. There is a constant discomfort because Ron is just constantly obnoxious, and that's the joke. And there's no escalation. It's just the discomfort part, and just him being an oblivious idiot, and that's all the joke is. It's like, because we had Ashton Kutcher like start off nervous, then get comfortable, then go right back into, oh, the shit has hit the fan, this is all wrong, and goes even far back to more nervous than when he was before. The dinner scene starts and ends in the same place. And so if it starts off either mildly funny or not funny at all, that's where it's going to end up to, because there's no change in the scene. I guess you could say what he says escalates once he gets to the pipe it and bitches thing, but no, the Guess Who scene showed exactly just how, of all things, just how much this scene just does not work. So there's that. So, and then we got the stuff to where, like, they see jokes that they realize people found funny in the first movie, so it's like, why not do them here? Like the fact that he calls Veronica a whore, or another variation of whore, pretty much every time he sees her in this movie. Now, I know it tends to come from because she's with Greg Kinnear now, but they just keep doing it, and I think it actually feels more like the only reason they banked on that so much was because people thought the Whore Island line was so funny in Anchorman. So it was like, okay, let's just keep having him call Veronica whore then, because the Whore Island line was so funny. It doesn't really work that way. The one joke that they bring back in regards to him and Veronica that they actually put a little more effort into, just one more detail that actually made it funnier than it was in the first movie. Like the one time they took a joke from the first movie and they actually made it funnier was something really brief and really small that they did. And that was the one where he gets set off. But obviously he and Veronica argue, and then she says that his hair looks dumb. And then we see the explosion in his eyes, and that's when the fight breaks out. We get the same scene in the second movie, only just before the explosion in his eyes, it's a clip of Jean-Claude Van Damme screaming in Bloodsport before the explosion. It's like, that little addition probably makes it funnier. That's like the one time where it's like, okay, take the joke, add something to it, and then you got something funnier. But you'll notice it's only because they added a detail, not because they dragged the joke fucking on and on and on. Or tried to take it too far. So, yeah. So just doing little things like that is where you actually come into it. And then, of course, we get into the stuff where, the whole blind. This is the part I hated even when I first saw it, when I was more or less praising the movie. The whole blind subplot. Where Anchorman's about an hour and a half or so, the first one, and to show you how much we're dragging it on, when around the point in the runtime where the first Anchorman was starting to come to a close, we begin the blind thing in Anchorman 2, where James Marsden, another new character who is perfectly cast, but they give him like one damn joke, and then just run it into the ground, and then set him up as an antagonist in a way that doesn't even matter in the long run. Does the whole thing where he trips and he falls and he's blinded. It's I think it's a take on Ice Castles, if anybody remembers that movie. Which is actually quite good, actually, even if it's some, cheesy sports movie from like the 70s or something. But the thing here, though, is that we go into this whole damn thing, and it's like, you want to talk the stuff in this movie that is just so dragged out beyond any comprehension. Yeah, 5 years after I saw it, this was haunting me. Like, when I was watching this again for the first time in 5 years, I was dreading for the blind subplot to come back. So, what we have here is they go out there and they talk to him, and we've got a whole scene that is just the same joke over and over and over and over again, where he says, I thought this one object that's not even like the object I was looking for was that object. And they say, you couldn't feel a difference, Ron? And he says, I'm blind. Repeat, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat. And that's what this fucking scene is. And he gets louder and more obnoxious the more times he says, I'm blind, which I guess is the movie's way of saying the scene escalated, which makes it funny the more times it happens. No, it fucking doesn't. And so, as it goes on, also, we talked about the fact that they avoided the death sentence of having a song in the movie with Afternoon Delight. Well, and I also forgot to mention this when I was talking about there were different stories in the first movie, and it was going to be like, they were going to have a plane crash and they were going to fight ninja monkeys and stuff like that. Yeah, that version also included a shark musical number. And apparently they were so fucking married to that idea, they never forgot it. So what did we get in Anchorman 2? Yeah. So we got the blind subplot is not enough. We have to have yet another subplot where he adopts the fucking shark. And yeah, maybe it's funny that during the musical number, it's this musical number like celebrating the shark's life while he's killing other creatures bloodily. But even so. And then they put a conflict within the conflict briefly, where Veronica was hiding up the fact that a surgeon called him and said they could fix his blindness. And it just feels so fucking endless. This far into the movie it began, and this is how far they fucking take it. And yeah, apparently it was supposed to be some, like, parody of those inspirational TV sports movies where somebody has to, like, overcome a disability and all that. Like a Lifetime movie or something. And then they double down on that by having the whole recital cliche. Like, doing the whole thing where they are like, oh, we're going to do a parody of, like, Hallmark movies, and it's like, oh, now we're going to do a parody of the whole dad running to see the recital cliche and all that. It's like, when the fuck did these movies even turn into that? Doing, like, full-on spoofs of other cliches. To this extent. To where they're plot points now. Like, suddenly in the last half hour of this movie, that's what the Anchorman movies are now. I don't know. So, yes, and we do eventually get to the big joke that they brought back, the Rumble, where, like I said, they do go really, really big, to where it's like, obviously the big cameo is, like, Tim Robbins, fresh off an Oscar win in Anchorman, And you're like, oh, yeah, well, I wonder what cameos they get for this. So we see, like, Sacha Baron Cohen. And it's like, alright, that makes sense. Talladega Nights connection, okay. Tina Fey and Amy Poehler. I think Amy Poehler was, like, in Anchorman, and they cut her scene. Once again, though, Saturday Night Live connection makes sense. And then Jim Carrey and Marion Cotillard appear. And it's like, alright, that's a pretty decent grab. Also got Kanye in here also, which is interesting, but not that surprising when we saw Drake in the first scene. So it's like, not that they're like comparable or anything, but just the in general, like branching out into like the music industry to get their cameos was like, alright, this isn't really the portion that we're in. This isn't the area of entertainment that this movie is like in, so okay, Drake and Kanye, I guess. Well, Kanye makes sense because he's for MTV, I guess. So, but then appears Will Smith, and then it's like, okay, the point of Will Smith, it does feel like they went all out. Like Jim Carrey back in the day probably would have been like the big one, but it's like Will Smith was like, okay, they did go all out. And then they're not even done with Will Smith. Then they bring in Liam Neeson. And then they do the whole thing where they did finally bring in John C. Reilly for the ghost of Stonewall Jackson. Which is a joke that's funny once. That's one of the things where it's kind of funny they explain a joke. When Ron says, like, we cannot ignore that the ghost of Stonewall Jackson is here. And then Kirsten Dunst at the top. So many damn cameos, I might have forgotten one. So, and then the whole battle ensues, and we do that whole thing. So, and then they thought they could make it, you know, really big and all that. So it's like they've got Brick with the space gun. They've got, like I said, doing the whole Ghost of Stonewall Jackson thing, taking souls out. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and all that. Got Will Smith bringing in planes, dropping bombs and shit. And it's like, I like the idea of the Rumble getting that big. But it also feels like there was a portion that we skipped. Like, they went way too far. Like, it feels like this would be... Like, if there had been an Anchorman 3, this would have been the brawl. Because it feels like there's a sort of a middle ground here. To where, like, you still could have gone way over the top without going this big. With the whole Harrison Ford's a werewolf thing. Like, it got to the point to where it was like... alright. To where it's like you had something here, but then it's like it just doesn't really, because the thing about Anchorman was the fact that this sort of came out of nowhere, and then the rest of the movie just kind of went about its way after it. But the fact that this is like the climax doesn't really have that same impact, and then there's also just the fact that it's like it doesn't have time to recover from it. It's like that's kind of what they leave us on, more or less. And then they drag it out still with the... in the middle of their epilogue, they bring the fucking shark thing back. And it's like, it just really, really feels endless and really takes anything out of it. The Greg Kinnear thing with the mines thing. It's one of those jokes that they got way too married to. And it's like, it was one thing and they kept dragging it out to where it was like, oh, you know, you're reading my mind, Greg Kinnear, stuff like that. And then like they kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And then it's like, by the time it's dead, they decide to give it this out of fucking nowhere payoff to where not only can he do that, but he can do... Yeah, it's fucking dumb. It's not... Like I said, I get where going all in seemed probably good on paper, but it's like... that was like the worst possible payoff for a joke that was already dead. It's like, so that's... So yeah, so that's what that is. It's kind of hard to believe that the next movie Adam McKay would go on to do would win him an Oscar and get nominated for Best Picture is insane, but there it is. So, yeah, like I said, it's sort of admirable, it's sort of admirable, where, to the point that while it does feel like there's so many jokes that are so flat, and it does feel like they just really half-assed their way through it, at the same time, it kind of doesn't feel lazy too. By the way, they're just grabbing from everywhere, and it seems like they're trying just about anything. And it's like, you know, I suppose good on them for being that committed to their jokes, if they're gonna, like, not all of them, obviously. Sometimes they're way too half-assed. Sometimes, like I said, they want to be half-rehashed. That's how half-assed they get. But it does... The fact that they did try to just really, really go in some places, and just try and try and try again, there is something admirable in there, but ultimately it's the movie's death, too. So that's... So yeah, so that's what this is. So obviously, everybody loves the first one still. Like I said, you don't even need to revisit it because it's just it just lives in your head. So just making those quotes have an infinite lifespan, all that stuff, everything in regards to that. There you go. So that's what we have here. I don't know. I don't know what the hell the next one is because there's going to be a lot going on throughout this week. So hopefully nothing is late. So we'll see what happens. So yeah, all of that's unpredictable. So I'm just going to stop this here. So until whatever the hell happens, that's it.